Foreign Affairs of the DGB under the chairmanship of the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan, Murat Nurlu. The meeting was very well prepared. Everyone noted the high quality of those negotiations, those consultations that took place on the eve at the level of our deputies and experts. The main focus was on the preparations for the November DGB summit in Astana. We are satisfied with the projects that will be considered by the heads of state. They cover the broad agenda of international relations and concrete steps for further development of the DGB. We paid special attention to the formation of the Eurasian security architecture in our discussions on the situation in the world. We replaced the schemes of ensuring stability that had the Euro-Atlantic dimension and discredited itself. President Putin spoke about this in detail at the Foreign Ministry on June 14. Today, we agreed to develop this topic in the work of our analytical units, including through regular consultations within the framework of the DGB. We agreed to develop cooperation and joint practical projects with the Alliance of Independent States and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There is mutual interest, including in the use of the potential of these structures for more effective anti-terrorist actions. We approved the DGB in the context of the fight against terrorism, new threats, and challenges. We approved the DGB in the context of the Tajik-Afghan border strengthening program. This document was previously approved by the defense ministers and the secretaries of the security councils. It is now being approved by the heads of state. The document provides additional impetus for the DGB's activities in the sphere of peacekeeping, including the cooperation with the UN peacekeeping operations. This is a very promising direction. We see good potential here. We agreed to activate the work on biological security. The Security Council Secretaries Committee has created a coordination committee on this topic, on biological issues, biological aspects of security. It is now headed by the Republic of Kazakhstan. During the year, a third meeting is planned to hold this important new structure. The statements have been approved. I would like to highlight the statement dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Belarus from the fascist invaders, the statement on the problems in the Middle East and North Africa, primarily in the context of the tragedy in the Palestinian sector of Gaza. Our positions were very clearly confirmed here. Another statement on the establishment of closer cooperation in the sphere of international information security and on the development of contacts and research in the sphere of peaceful use of space. On July 19, the UN Security Council meeting will be held in New York under the presidency of the Russian Federation. It will be devoted to cooperation between the United Nations, the CSTO, the CIS, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Russian Federation has been invited to speak at this meeting. The UN Security Council President in July proposed this topic and received support. We invited the General Secretary of the CSTO, Emangali Tazmagambatov, to speak at this meeting. These are the main conclusions I would like to tell you about. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. What is the important vector of cooperation between the countries of the CSTO at the current stage? What are the main threats to the participants of the organization today? I have already mentioned the threats that continue to come from the territory of Afghanistan. There are still strong ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and affiliated groups there. The Taliban government is fighting these terrorist groups. We believe it is crucial to assist in this fight. In general, we support the establishment of a more stable, constant, and objective dialogue with the Taliban government, which is actually controlling the country. This was the prevailing opinion during the discussions that I am telling you about today. The threats from the Middle East and North Africa are also coming from the unresolved conflict. First of all, the situation in Palestine and Israel is unresolved. It was abandoned long ago, after Israel decided to carry out a special operation in response to the October 7th terrorist attack. We cannot accept the methods of the Israeli military, which claim to destroy Hamas. In fact, they are destroying civilians. The most important thing is that such actions will further promote a stable and long-term peace in the Middle East. Through the establishment of a Palestinian state in full compliance with the UN resolutions. It is clear that the postponement of these processes has an impact on the neighboring territories. Terrorists are moving to Europe, to our neighbors, primarily Central Asia and the Caucasus. We are following this direction and are trying to contribute to the situation. To transform it into a political solution based on the UN resolution. The western direction of the OSCE is a serious threat to the Russian Federation. We have discussed this in detail today, including in the context of the actions of the Russian Federation. I am sure that you are familiar with the statements of President Putin on the Ukrainian crisis as a result of his visits to the Korean People's Democratic Republic and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. You know these statements. We have confirmed our intention to achieve fair regulation. Based on the recognition of the legitimate rights of the people whose ancestors lived. Settled and developed the territories. The Kiev junta, after the anti-communist coup in February 2014, was a terrorist organization and made a series of decisions that prohibited the Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian media. Today, I have drawn the attention of my colleagues to the comments of the West on the results of this event in Buggenstock, Switzerland. The United States, Biden, US, EU, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, and Zelensky have all made The UN Security Council and Mr. Zelensky have stated that they are seeking a fair regulation on the basis of the UN Charter as a non-alternative criterion that should be guided. From this non-alternative document, they highlight only territorial integrity, forgetting that the UN Charter has the right to self-determination and that the General Assembly, when considering the relationship between territorial integrity and the right to self-determination, has decided in a special declaration that everyone should respect the territorial integrity of the states whose governments comply with the principle of self-determination of nations, and therefore represent all the peoples living. On this territory, that is, the territorial integrity of the states whose governments represent all the peoples should be respected. I hope that no one needs to explain to anyone that the ultra-radical neo-Nazis who came to power after the February 2014 coup could not represent Crimea, Donbass, or Novorossiya. But this is the principle of the Charter, which is categorically ignored by the West and its puppets. Another thing related to this is that in the UN Charter, in Article 1, it is clearly stated that all UN members must respect human rights regardless of race, gender, language, or religion. Both Russian and Orthodox in the face of the canonical Orthodox Church of Ukraine are prohibited by the Kiev regime. Therefore, if we talk about how to implement the UN Charter, we are always ready to do so. The other side does not want to talk about the principles of the Charter, as it should be for any UN member, but wants to take out of this context what suits them today. Of course, we could not ignore the threats that are accumulating not only in the West, but also in the East. We hear aggressive statements from NATO, including the Secretary-General Stoltenberg, that NATO is a defensive alliance, but today NATO faces threats from the East. Russia, China, Canada, and Iran are the sources of threats from the East. Mr. Stoltenberg states that we should ensure our security far beyond our responsibility. NATO wants to privatize all security mechanisms in the Asia-Pacific region, which the alliance calls the Indo-Pacific region. It creates fours, threes, and other structures of so-called small configuration. Which are the progenitors of military units. These military units are aimed at confrontation with those who are considered by NATO as opponents or even competitors. They include the People's Republic of China, the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, and Russia. We have discussed all this. In our relations with various structures on the Eurasian continent, especially with ASEAN, we will firmly defend the need to preserve the principles of the security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. This is a network of unions, which are grouped around ASEAN on the basis of the principles of equality, of equal and indivisible security, consensus, and mutual respect. The West wants to destroy these structures. Therefore, the threats to Eurasian security come from different directions. In most cases, the aggressive line of NATO is the source of these threats. It wants to privatize all issues related to stability in our vast territory. As I said at the beginning, we do not want to rely on the mechanisms created in the context of the Euro-Atlantic security. This includes NATO and the OSCE. We want to work with those countries that realize their national interests. So that the contours of Eurasian security are discussed and agreed upon by the countries of the Eurasian continent. The President said this when he gave a speech on June 14 in the UN. He stressed that we consider it important to make these discussions open for all. Without exception, the countries of Eurasia and the unions that represent a part of Eurasia. This means openness and a call for equal dialogue. I see difficulties along this path. In particular, NATO will prevent such a fair process. However, this is an absolutely non-alternative path. Ultimately, this logic and philosophy will prevail. It is fully compatible with the principles of the OSCE, the CIS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other subregional structures in Eurasia. Mr. President, the Ukrainian media has announced that the next summit in Ukraine will be the end of the conflict and Russia will be invited. Are there any prerequisites for Moscow's participation in such a summit? What countries and what forms of peace should be presented there for a full dialogue? I have stopped judging what the Ukrainian media is saying. There were many threats, promises, and demands. They claim that all Russians should leave Ukraine, as Zelensky did before the start of the special military operation. They threaten to destroy Russia, to imprison and physically liquidate Russians when Ukraine returns Crimea, Donbass, and other territories. This should have raised questions about the adequacy and compliance of the Kiev regime with European values, which, as the West claims, Zelensky supports in the fight against Russia. This is a disgrace for those who claim to be the bearers of the ideal of democracy. I have long since stopped reading and analyzing their claims. The whole purpose of the summit was to consolidate the majority of countries around Zelensky's formula. In the process, they realized that the majority does not want to sign ultimatums to Russia. Such as the withdrawal from Crimea and Donbass, the agreement to create a tribunal where Russia will be tried, the agreement to pay reparations, and the withdrawal from Crimea. The world's majority did not want to sign the agreement. Then, they changed the agenda and put food security, nuclear security, and humanitarian issues at the forefront. This set of questions will allow the maximum number of signatories to sign the agreement. It did not work out. Only those countries signed the agreement, which are fighting the Russian Federation, which are arming Ukraine and imposing sanctions, and several countries from the global south signed the agreement. Now, I have a very interesting observation. Food security and nuclear security. Nuclear security is formulated in the sense that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant should be returned to the Ukrainian hands. However, for some reason, no one from the organizers of the meeting in Switzerland mentioned energy security in the broadest sense. I am convinced that if they talked about energy security, the majority of the countries invited, not the Western ones, would be interested in what happened to the northern streams, which played a huge role in ensuring energy security, not only European. But also global, as they would provide a significant share of Europe's energy security. They do not want to talk about the stories that would mean their self-denial. The statement that Russia should be invited was made by many participants of the Swiss meeting. If you are convinced of this, why are you going to do without Russia? Secondly, if, as you say, Russia will be invited when the Western Ukrainian Corps formulates its position and this position is presented to Russia, then it is impossible to talk to Russia as another ultimatum. If they do not understand this, I feel sorry for their diplomatic capabilities, which they have lost by substituting diplomacy with sanctions and ultimatum blackmail. The most realistic basis was proposed by President Putin. The countries that are clearly and unambiguously designated as Russian territories in our constitution should be completely free from foreign troops, instructors, mercenaries, and, of course, weapons. I will repeat the sequence of developments that President Putin mentioned in one of his recent speeches. In February 2014, the agreement on the settlement of the French, German, and Polish borders was signed. President Putin was asked by the Europeans and U.S. President Obama not to obstruct the signing of the agreement and not to support it. Russia did not obstruct it. The agreement was signed. In the morning, the opposition, under the influence of Washington, breaks the agreement, announces sanctions against the Russian language, declares the Crimeans as violators of certain rules, as if they were terrorists. This is the beginning of the period that lasted a year before the signing of the Minsk agreements. If the agreement on the settlement of the Minsk agreements had not been broken in February 2014, Ukraine would have been within the borders of 1991, the borders that it so passionately dreams of. by the hands of those who came to power through the bloody coup d'etat and began to introduce Russophobic and neo-Nazi orders. Ukraine destroyed its territorial integrity. In Minsk, in February 2015, the agreements approved by the UN Security Council were reached. If they had been fulfilled, Ukraine would have restored its territorial integrity, but without Crimea. This fact was recognized by almost all Western countries at that time. Ukraine did not want to preserve its territorial integrity at the cost of giving Donbass, Lugansk, and Donetsk elementary autonomous rights, including the right to speak their native language. It did not want to do this, because it contradicted the aspirations of those who led Ukraine along the Russophobic and neo-Nazi path. The next step, when Ukraine lost the chance to preserve its territorial integrity, was the Istanbul Agreements of April 2022, which also guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity, but on the basis of the realities that had already taken place on the ground. As you know, the Western curators again prohibited Zelensky from signing these agreements. The process is underway. We have now come to the fourth proposal from the Russian Federation in the form of President Putin's initiative from June 14th. Let them draw conclusions. I believe that serious politicians, and there are still some of them, understand the need to include their intellectual and diplomatic abilities and start thinking about real politics, not about illusions. Has the procedure for Armenia's withdrawal from the ODKB been discussed today? Is there a specific answer to this question? Are there already candidates to replace Armenia? You may not continue, because there is no immediate answer. The procedure for Armenia's withdrawal from the ODKB has not been discussed, because there has been no response to the request. Hello, Mr. President. Denis Sorobyov, Izvestia. I will continue with my colleague's question. What may be the consequences of Armenia's withdrawal from the ODKB? Can this affect the organization's defense capabilities? You know, it is not in the tradition of their diplomacy to guess whether there is an ODKB. As I have already said, yes, today the Armenian minister was not present at the meeting, but no document from Armenia, no official step that would make it necessary to discuss the consequences of what happened, did not take place. That's all. Mr. President, you said that today the issue of